January 14, 1942. Fernando Po, Spanish Guinea. The night descended like a thick curtain over the small port of Santa Isabel, carrying with it the mingled scents of diesel oil, salt spray, and rotting timber from the colonial docks. The humid air pressed against everything with tropical weight, muffling sound and obscuring vision beyond 30 yards. In the harbor's murky waters, 3 vessels rocked gently at their moorings. The German freighter Licomba, her hull scarred from months of Atlantic convoy duty, the Italian merchant ship Duchessa d'Aosta with her distinctive yellow funnel marking, and the powerful German tugboat Büsing, her engines still warm from the day's harbor work. These ships represented more than mere tonnage. They were lifelines for the Axis war machine, carrying vital spare parts, encrypted communications equipment, and most importantly, codebooks that could unlock German naval communications across the entire West African theater. The Port Authority had logged their arrival 3 days earlier, noting in careful Spanish script that all documentation appeared proper and their neutrality papers were in order. What the harbor master did not record was the subtle observation made by a man in weathered civilian clothes who had watched the ships arrive from a waterfront cafe, nursing the same cup of coffee for 2 hours while memorizing every detail of their anchorage positions, guard rotations, and the precise distance from the harbor mouth to open waters. 50 yards offshore, concealed in the shadow of an abandoned fishing vessel, a converted Spanish coaster named Vulcan Mission drifted silently on the tide. Her appearance suggested nothing more threatening than a typical colonial supply vessel, perhaps delivering goods to the isolated island communities scattered across the Gulf of Guinea. The rust stains on her sides, the patched canvas covering her cargo holds, even the washing line strung between her masts. Every detail had been carefully arranged to project an image of mundane commercial purpose. Below decks, however, the reality was dramatically different. The ship's hold contained enough plastic explosives to sink a destroyer, magnetic limpet mines designed by British ordnance specialists specifically for sabotage operations, silent cutting tools fabricated from hardened steel, and waterproof communication equipment that could maintain contact with Royal Navy submarines operating 300 miles away. The crew, officially listed as Spanish nationals on the ship's papers, were in fact members of Britain's most secretive military unit, the small-scale raiding force, commanded by Major Gus March Phillips, a veteran of irregular warfare operations who had earned his reputation conducting sabotage missions along the Norwegian coast. These men had been selected not just for their technical skills or physical courage, but for their ability to operate in the gray zones of warfare, where traditional military rules did not apply, where success depended on audacity, improvisation, and the willingness to risk execution as pirates if captured. The mission they were about to attempt violated every convention of neutral waters, international maritime law, and diplomatic protocol. Spain maintained official neutrality in the war, though its sympathies clearly lay with the Axis powers. Any British military action on Spanish territory would constitute an act of war, potentially driving Franco's government into formal alliance with Hitler and opening a second front across the Pyrenees that Britain could not afford. Yet here they were, preparing to steal 3 enemy vessels from a Spanish port, in full view of Spanish military installations, with Spanish coastal artillery positioned less than half a mile away on the volcanic slopes above Santa Isabel. The operation had been personally approved by Winston Churchill himself, who had scrawled in the margin of the authorization document, "The gloves are off in Africa. Take what we need." The Prime Minister understood that conventional rules of engagement had become luxuries Britain could no longer afford. Every ship, every spare part, every coded message that reached Axis forces represented British sailors who would die in the North Atlantic, African soldiers who would face better-equipped enemies, and strategic positions that would be lost to forces with superior logistics. The mathematics of total war were brutally simple. Steal their supplies, or watch your own forces starve. The 3 target vessels represented a prize beyond their apparent commercial value. Intelligence reports indicated that Licomba carried precision-engineered components for German submarine engines, parts so specialized that their loss would ground U-boats across the entire African theater for months. Duchessa d'Aosta held captured Allied documents that had been processed by Italian cryptographers, potentially compromising British codes throughout the Mediterranean. Most valuable of all was Büsing's cargo, complete sets of German naval codes, weather routing instructions, and recognition signals that would allow Allied forces to masquerade as Axis vessels or intercept and decode enemy transmissions for months to come. The intelligence value of these materials was incalculable, but their capture required something more than conventional naval warfare. A traditional attack would sink the ships and destroy their precious cargo. A diplomatic protest would take months and likely fail entirely. What was needed was something unprecedented in modern warfare. A theft so audacious, so technically perfect, that the enemy would lose their most valuable assets without understanding how or why until it was far too late to respond. March Phillips had studied every aspect of Fernando Po's geography, climate, and political situation. The island's strategic position in the Bight of Biafra made it a crucial way station for Axis shipping, but its isolation also created opportunities. Spanish authority was represented by a garrison of fewer than 200 soldiers, most of them colonial conscripts with limited training and questionable loyalty to a distant government. The harbor defenses consisted of 2 antiquated coastal guns that had not been fired in live exercises for over a decade. More importantly, the Spanish colonial administration operated on bureaucratic principles that prized avoiding responsibility above taking decisive action. A suspicious incident that might require explanations to Madrid would likely be investigated cautiously, giving skilled infiltrators precious time to complete their mission and escape. The harbor itself offered additional advantages: deep water channels that would allow rapid departure, prevailing winds that would carry sound away from the shore, and tide tables that could be exploited to minimize the engine noise required for navigation. Every detail had been analyzed, every contingency planned, but March Phillips understood that no plan survived contact with reality. Success would depend not on perfect execution, but on the ability to adapt when everything went wrong. The psychological profile of the enemy also played a crucial role in the mission's conception. German naval officers, despite their professional competence, carried an ingrained assumption that their enemies would respect international law and diplomatic protocol. This assumption had been reinforced by 2 years of warfare, in which British forces had generally operated within conventional military parameters, launching attacks only against legitimate military targets in recognized war zones. The idea that British special forces might conduct criminal acts of piracy in neutral waters was simply outside the conceptual framework that guided German strategic thinking. They had taken reasonable precautions, posting sentries, maintaining radio watches, keeping their engines ready for rapid departure, but these precautions were designed to defend against conventional military attacks, not against adversaries willing to risk execution as common pirates. This cognitive blind spot would be exploited ruthlessly by men who understood that total war recognized no boundaries between legal and illegal action, only between effective and ineffective methods. The Spanish colonial authorities harbored their own assumptions that would prove equally vulnerable to exploitation. The local governor had received explicit instructions from Madrid to maintain strict neutrality while avoiding any incidents that might provide Britain or Germany with pretexts for intervention. This meant that Spanish forces were under orders to avoid engagement except in cases of undeniable aggression against Spanish territory or personnel. Ambiguous situations were to be reported to higher authority rather than resolved through immediate military action. March Phillips counted on this bureaucratic paralysis to provide the crucial minutes his team would need to clear the harbor before Spanish commanders could decide whether they were witnessing a legitimate military operation or a criminal act that demanded immediate response. The confusion would be amplified by carefully prepared deception measures. False radio transmissions suggesting the ship movements were part of a Spanish harbor exercise, forged documentation that could be discovered after the fact to suggest official authorization, and Spanish-speaking team members who could provide plausible explanations for any direct challenges from harbor authorities. The men selected for this operation represented the elite of British special forces, each chosen for specific skills that would be essential for success. Geoffrey Appleyard, March Phillips's second-in-command, had earned his reputation as a demolitions expert, capable of placing charges with surgical precision even under fire. His specialty was the silent destruction of critical infrastructure without collateral damage that might alert enemy forces or compromise future operations. Graham Hayes brought expertise in small boat operations, Having spent months training with Royal Navy coastal forces in the treacherous waters around the Scottish Islands, where tides, weather, and visibility could change without warning. Anders Lassen, a Danish volunteer who had escaped occupied Europe through a harrowing journey across Nazi-controlled territory, possessed an almost supernatural ability to move silently in darkness, appearing and disappearing like a ghost while accomplishing impossible infiltration missions. Leslie Prout served as the team's communications specialist, maintaining contact with submarine support units while operating radio equipment that had to remain undetected by enemy monitoring stations across West Africa. Each team member also carried dual sets of identification documents, official papers identifying them as civilians working for various humanitarian organizations, and sealed orders that would designate them as prisoners of war if captured during actual combat operations. The distinction was crucial, but deliberately ambiguous. If apprehended during the mission, they could claim civilian status and demand consular protection, potentially avoiding immediate execution. However, this protection would last only as long as Spanish authorities remained uncertain about the true nature of their activities. Once the stolen ships were discovered missing, all pretense would collapse, and any captured team members would face trial as pirates, a capital offense under both Spanish and international law. Each man understood that success was not just a military objective, but quite literally a matter of life and death. There would be no prisoner exchanges, no diplomatic interventions, no second chances. They would succeed and escape, or they would die. The technical challenges of the operation were unlike anything attempted in modern naval warfare. Stealing a single ship required enormous skill and planning. Stealing 3 simultaneously while maintaining complete silence and avoiding detection by harbor authorities demanded innovations in tactics and equipment that had never been tested under combat conditions. The team's cutting tools had been specially designed to slice through steel anchor chains without producing the sparks that would be visible to sentries. Magnetic grappling hooks allowed them to scale ship hulls without making noise that would alert sleeping crew members. Waterproof adhesive charges could disable engine room systems without explosions that would wake the entire harbor. Most ingeniously, they carried acoustic dampening equipment that could muffle the engine sounds of captured vessels during the critical first minutes of their escape. Every piece of equipment had been tested repeatedly in Scottish locks under conditions that approximated the mission environment, but the team understood that no training exercise could fully replicate the psychological pressure of operating in enemy territory where a single mistake would mean death or capture. The intelligence preparation for Operation Postmaster had required months of careful surveillance and information gathering that stretched across 3 continents. British agents in Madrid had cultivated relationships with Spanish colonial administrators, gradually building detailed pictures of Fernando Po's military capabilities and political constraints. Portuguese merchants with business connections throughout West Africa provided commercial intelligence about shipping schedules, cargo manifests, and harbor procedures. Most valuable of all were the reports from local African workers who serviced the German and Italian vessels, men whose apparent invisibility to European colonial officers allowed them to observe and report details about crew rotations, security procedures, and the precise location of the most valuable cargo. This human intelligence network had required careful development over months of patient work, establishing trust relationships and payment systems that could operate without detection by enemy counterintelligence services. The network's existence itself represented a significant strategic asset that would be compromised if the mission failed and led to investigations by Spanish or German security services. The psychological preparation of the team was equally important and considerably more complex. Each man had to be mentally prepared for the possibility of killing German and Italian sailors who were simply doing their duty, potentially including men who might be sleeping in their bunks when the raiders arrived. The moral weight of this possibility was balanced against the strategic necessity of preventing these ships and their cargo from reaching destinations where they would enable the killing of British and Allied forces. March Phillips had addressed this dilemma directly in his final briefing. "We are not murderers, but we are at war. Every bolt, every spare part, every coded message that reaches the enemy will cost Allied lives. Our job is to prevent that cost, using whatever means prove necessary." The men understood that they were not embarking on a conventional military operation, with clear rules of engagement and defined objectives. They were entering a realm of warfare where success would be measured not by territory captured or enemies killed, but by the degree to which they could cripple enemy logistics, while avoiding diplomatic repercussions that might harm Britain's strategic position. The harbor of Santa Isabel had been studied with the intensity that earlier generations of warriors had devoted to fortified positions they intended to assault. Every tide table had been memorized, every wind pattern analyzed, every approach route tested by observation from multiple vantage points around the port. The team knew that Spanish sentries were relieved every 4 hours, that the harbormaster's office closed at sunset and did not reopen until dawn, that the coastal artillery positions were manned by skeleton crews during night hours. They had identified the precise location of the telephone lines connecting the port to Spanish military headquarters, the backup radio equipment that would be used if primary communications failed, and the patrol routes followed by harbor security boats during different weather conditions. Most critically, they had determined the exact time required for Spanish forces to respond to an alarm. 12 minutes from the first alert to the arrival of armed troops at the harbor, 17 minutes to bring the coastal guns into action, 23 minutes to launch pursuit vessels capable of overtaking escaping raiders. These timing calculations were based on careful observation of Spanish military exercises, conducted during daylight hours under optimal conditions. The team understood that nighttime operations would likely require additional time for Spanish forces to organize effective responses, but they could not depend on enemy confusion or incompetence. Their plan had to assume that Spanish forces would react with maximum efficiency and still provide sufficient margins for escape. This meant that the entire operation, from initial approach to final departure from territorial waters, had to be completed within 20 minutes, including time to cut anchor chains, board, and secure 3 separate vessels, disable any resistance from their crews, and begin the complex process of towing the captured ships out of harbor while maintaining formation and avoiding underwater obstacles that could disable their engines or tear holes in their hulls. The deception plan was as elaborate as the operation itself and required coordination with British intelligence services operating across Europe and Africa. False radio transmissions would be broadcast from Royal Navy submarines to suggest that British forces were conducting operations hundreds of miles away from Fernando Po, drawing Spanish attention toward areas where no British forces were actually present. Forged documents would be planted in neutral ports, suggesting that the German and Italian vessels were scheduled for departure on dates well after the actual mission, creating confusion about whether their disappearance represented theft or simply changes in shipping schedules. Portuguese and Free French agents would spread rumors about German submarine activity near the South African coast, encouraging Spanish authorities to focus their surveillance efforts on areas far from the actual operation. These deception measures would not prevent the eventual discovery that the ships had been stolen, but they might delay that discovery long enough for the team to escape beyond the range of effective pursuit. The escape route itself presented challenges that required both technical expertise and considerable courage. Once clear of Fernando Po's harbor, the captured vessels would have to travel nearly 400 miles to reach British-controlled waters, maintaining radio silence while navigating shipping lanes that were regularly patrolled by German submarines and Italian reconnaissance aircraft. The tugboat Büssing, despite her powerful engines, could not tow 2 larger vessels at speeds exceeding 8 knots without risking structural damage to the towing cables or excessive noise that could be detected by enemy monitoring stations. This meant that the escape would require at least 50 hours of continuous operation, during which the team would be vulnerable to interception by any Axis forces that might be alerted to their activities. Fuel consumption calculations indicated that they would have barely enough diesel to reach friendly waters, with no reserves for evasive maneuvering or extended operations if they encountered enemy forces. Weather conditions would play a crucial role in determining the mission's success or failure. The monsoon season in the Gulf of Guinea created predictable patterns of wind and rainfall that could either conceal the operation or make it impossible to execute safely. Heavy rain would muffle engine noise and reduce visibility for Spanish sentries, but it would also make the handling of cutting tools and climbing equipment extremely dangerous on wet steel decks. Strong winds could provide additional acoustic cover, but would increase the difficulty of maintaining precise positioning during the delicate process of securing towing cables to captured vessels. The team had identified a weather window lasting approximately 6 days during which conditions would be optimal for the operation. but they understood that their schedule was completely dependent on meteorological factors beyond their control. If weather conditions deteriorated during the mission, they would have to abort and potentially wait weeks for another opportunity that might never come. The human cost of failure extended far beyond the immediate team. British intelligence networks throughout West Africa had been developed over months of patient work, often at considerable risk to local agents who faced death if discovered by German or Italian security services. A failed mission would trigger extensive counterintelligence investigations that could roll up these networks and eliminate Britain's ability to monitor Axis shipping throughout the region. More broadly, failure would demonstrate to neutral nations that Britain lacked the capability to project power beyond traditional military theaters, potentially encouraging countries like Spain, Turkey, and Argentina to align more closely with what might appear to be the winning side. The strategic implications of Operation Postmaster therefore extended far beyond the immediate value of the 3 target vessels. Success would prove that British forces could strike anywhere, at any time, using methods that conventional military thinking could not anticipate or counter. Failure would reveal limitations that enemies could exploit, and neutrals could interpret as signs of declining British power. March Phillips understood these broader implications, but also recognized that dwelling on them could paralyze decision-making during the critical moments when adaptation and quick thinking would determine success or failure. He had trained his team to focus on immediate, concrete objectives while maintaining awareness of the larger strategic picture. Each man knew his specific responsibilities during every phase of the operation, but each was also prepared to assume command if circumstances required it. This redundancy of leadership was essential for operations conducted in environments where communication was limited and conditions could change rapidly. The team had practiced scenario after scenario during their training in Scotland, but they understood that the actual mission would present challenges that no amount of rehearsal could fully anticipate. Success would depend not on perfect execution of a predetermined plan, but on the ability to solve problems in real time while maintaining focus on the ultimate objective. The ships rocked gently at anchor in the pre-dawn darkness, their crews sleeping peacefully in the humid tropical night, unaware that they were about to become unwilling participants in one of the most audacious maritime thefts in military history. German sentries walked their prescribed routes with the mechanical precision of professional sailors, checking familiar spaces and finding everything exactly as it should be. Italian officers completed their routine radio checks with harbor authorities, reporting all quiet and receiving standard acknowledgments that were dutifully logged in official communications records. Spanish coastal observers maintained their watches from positions that commanded excellent views of the harbor approaches, scanning horizons that revealed nothing more threatening than fishing vessels and inter-island trading craft. In a few minutes, this peaceful scene would be shattered by an operation that would be remembered as a masterpiece of special warfare tactics, a demonstration that audacity combined with technical skill could achieve what entire fleets might fail to accomplish through conventional military action. The stage was set, the players were in position, and history was about to witness something entirely unprecedented in the annals of maritime warfare. The German officers stationed in Santa Isabel had established a comfortable routine during their months of service in Spanish Guinea. Captain Heinrich Müller, of the Merchant Marine, spent most evenings at the Club Colonial, where Spanish administrators and Axis representatives gathered to drink whiskey and complain about the primitive conditions of colonial life. The conversation inevitably turned to speculation about British capabilities and intentions in West Africa. Müller, a veteran of Atlantic convoy battles, often regaled his audience with stories of Royal Navy incompetence and cowardice. "They run from our U-boats like frightened rabbits," he would declare, raising his glass in mock salute to absent enemies. "The English only fight when they have overwhelming advantage. Here in neutral waters, they wouldn't dare show their faces." His Italian counterpart, Commander Antonio Rossi, nodded agreement while privately harboring more complex thoughts about British capabilities. Rossi had served in the Mediterranean, where British forces had demonstrated considerable skill and determination in operations around Malta and Alexandria. But even Rossi could not conceive of British forces conducting criminal acts of piracy in neutral Spanish waters. Such actions would violate every principle of international law and diplomatic protocol that governed civilized warfare between European nations. The Spanish colonial garrison shared this confident assessment of British limitations, though for different reasons. Colonel José Ramírez, the military commander of Fernando Po, had received explicit instructions from Madrid regarding the maintenance of strict neutrality in all circumstances short of direct attack on Spanish territory or personnel. These instructions emphasized that Spain's survival depended on avoiding involvement in the broader war while extracting maximum economic advantage from the competing demands of both sides. German and Italian vessels paid substantial fees for harbor services, fuel, and supplies, providing revenue that the impoverished colonial administration desperately needed. British interference with this profitable arrangement was theoretically possible, but it would require violations of international law so blatant that they would justify Spanish entry into the war on the Axis side, an outcome that Britain could not afford and would therefore avoid at all costs. This logic seemed unassailable to men who understood warfare in terms of nation-states acting rationally to protect their strategic interests. They could not imagine adversaries who might prioritize tactical advantage over diplomatic consequences, or who might accept enormous risks to achieve objectives that conventional military thinking would consider secondary. The dismissive attitude toward British capabilities was reinforced by intelligence assessments that reached Axis forces through multiple channels. German naval intelligence had concluded that British special forces lacked the training and equipment necessary for complex operations in tropical environments. Italian military attachés reported that Royal Navy units in West Africa were primarily concerned with convoy protection and lacked the specialized vessels required for amphibious operations. Spanish colonial administrators, eager to maintain profitable relationships with their Axis customers, consistently minimized reports of suspicious British activities while emphasizing the strength of Spanish defenses and the certainty of Spanish retaliation against any violations of neutrality. This intelligence picture, while not entirely inaccurate, failed to account for the existence of British Special Forces units that operated outside normal military structures and employed tactics that conventional intelligence services could not anticipate or counter. The psychological foundation of Axis confidence was perhaps even more important than the specific intelligence assessments that supported it. German naval doctrine emphasized the importance of overwhelming force and technological superiority in achieving decisive victories. The idea that small groups of lightly armed raiders might accomplish what major fleet operations could not achieve was fundamentally inconsistent with German strategic thinking, which had been shaped by decades of planning for large-scale conventional warfare between industrial powers. Italian military culture placed similar emphasis on formal military honor and adherence to established protocols. The notion that British officers might disguise themselves as civilian criminals to conduct piratical raids was offensive to professional sensibilities that viewed such tactics as beneath the dignity of civilized European armies. Even Spanish colonial authorities, despite their official neutrality, had been influenced by years of exposure to Axis propaganda that portrayed British forces as declining relics of imperial power, capable of bullying weak opponents but helpless against the modern military capabilities of Germany and Italy. This confidence extended to the practical security measures implemented to protect Axis shipping in Santa Isabel. The German vessels maintained standard watch schedules appropriate for friendly neutral ports, with minimal security precautions beyond basic fire prevention and routine maintenance procedures. Crew members were allowed shore leave according to normal merchant marine practices, reducing the number of personnel aboard the ships during evening hours when most recreational activities took place in the port's limited entertainment establishments. Radio watches were maintained, but focused primarily on weather reports and shipping schedules rather than military communications that might indicate hostile activity in the surrounding waters. The Italian command had installed additional communications equipment aboard Duchessa d'Aosta, but this was intended primarily for coordination with other Italian vessels, rather than for defense against attack. Even the most security-conscious German officers could not imagine scenarios that would require defensive measures against adversaries willing to conduct criminal acts in neutral waters while risking execution as pirates. The Spanish colonial authorities had implemented their own security measures, but these were designed primarily to demonstrate compliance with neutrality requirements rather than to provide effective protection against determined adversaries. Harbor patrols were conducted according to schedules that prioritized visibility over effectiveness. ensuring that Spanish officials could document their efforts to maintain order without creating the kind of unpredictable security environment that might complicate the commercial activities upon which colonial revenues depended. Coastal artillery positions were manned but not maintained in states of combat readiness that would require expensive ammunition expenditures or extensive training exercises. Communication systems were adequate for normal administrative purposes, but had not been tested under the kind of stress conditions that would arise during actual military emergencies. Most importantly, the Spanish command structure reflected bureaucratic priorities that valued avoiding responsibility over taking decisive action, creating exactly the kind of decision-making paralysis that skilled special forces could exploit during the critical minutes when immediate response would be most effective. The tactical situation in Fernando Po Harbor therefore presented German and Italian forces with what military theorists would later recognize as a classic example of overconfidence creating vulnerability. The Axis vessels were positioned to facilitate normal port operations, rather than to provide mutual support during emergency situations. Their crews were distributed according to peacetime practices, rather than wartime security requirements. Communication procedures were adequate for routine coordination but inadequate for rapid response to unexpected threats. Most critically, the entire security architecture was based on assumptions about enemy capabilities and intentions that bore little relationship to the actual capabilities and intentions of the forces preparing to attack them. The Germans expected British forces to behave like conventional naval units operating within established legal and diplomatic constraints. They prepared to defend against attacks by identifiable military forces using recognized weapons and tactics against legitimate military targets. They could not prepare to defend against criminals willing to steal their ships using civilian disguises and illegal methods while accepting the risk of execution if captured. This intelligence failure was compounded by the inherent limitations of operating in colonial environments where reliable information was difficult to obtain and verify. German and Italian officers were dependent on Spanish authorities for intelligence about local conditions, but Spanish colonial administrators had their own reasons for filtering and interpreting information in ways that supported their political and economic objectives. African workers and Portuguese merchants who might possess valuable intelligence about British activities were generally considered unreliable sources, whose reports required confirmation through official channels that were slow and often compromised. Even when accurate intelligence was available, it was often discounted because it conflicted with preconceived notions about what kinds of operations were feasible or likely in particular strategic environments. The result was an intelligence picture that provided false confidence while failing to identify the most serious threats actually developing in the operational area. The broader strategic context also contributed to Axis overconfidence regarding British capabilities in West Africa. German U-boat operations in the Atlantic had achieved spectacular successes during 1941 and early 1942, sinking merchant vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them and creating genuine concerns about Britain's ability to maintain essential supply lines. These successes had generated a psychological momentum that influenced German assessments of British morale, capabilities, and strategic options. If British forces were struggling to protect their own shipping lanes, how could they possibly find the resources and personnel necessary for offensive operations in secondary theaters like West Africa? Italian forces had achieved their own successes in East Africa and the Mediterranean, creating similar confidence about the declining effectiveness of British military power in regions far from the primary European theaters of operations. This strategic perspective was not entirely wrong. Britain was indeed struggling with resource limitations and strategic overextension, but it failed to account for the possibility that desperation might inspire innovations in tactics and strategic thinking that could multiply the effectiveness of limited forces. The psychological dimensions of this overconfidence were reinforced by cultural factors that shaped how German and Italian officers understood warfare and military effectiveness. The German military tradition emphasized systematic planning, overwhelming force, and technological superiority as the foundations of military success. Operations that relied on deception, improvisation, or criminal methods were viewed as signs of weakness rather than strength. Temporary expedients that might achieve limited tactical gains but could not provide the kind of decisive strategic victories that would determine the war's outcome. Italian military culture shared many of these assumptions, while adding its own emphasis on military honor and adherence to established protocols that governed civilized warfare between European powers. Neither military tradition could easily accommodate the possibility that adversaries might achieve significant strategic gains through methods that conventional military thinking would classify as piracy or terrorism rather than legitimate warfare. The colonial environment itself contributed additional layers of overconfidence that would prove fatally misguided. European officers serving in tropical territories often developed exaggerated assessments of their own capabilities and security, partly because colonial populations appeared unable to challenge European military superiority using conventional methods. The assumption that local populations would remain passive observers of conflicts between European powers was based on decades of colonial experience, but it failed to account for the possibility that skilled adversaries might recruit local allies or exploit local knowledge to achieve objectives that would be impossible using conventional military approaches. The isolation of colonial outposts also created false confidence, because it seemed to provide natural protection against enemy operations, when in fact it often created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by adversaries willing to accept the risks and logistical challenges of operations in remote locations. The immediate tactical situation in Santa Isabel Harbor reflected all of these broader strategic and psychological factors. German and Italian vessels were moored in positions that facilitated normal port operations, but created opportunities for raiders who could approach under cover of darkness using small boats that would be invisible to standard harbor security measures. Crew schedules followed peacetime patterns that minimized the number of personnel on duty during night hours, creating windows of vulnerability that lasted for hours at a time. Communication procedures were adequate for routine coordination, but entirely inadequate for responding to simultaneous attacks on multiple vessels by adversaries using unconventional methods and equipment. Most importantly, the psychological preparation of Axis personnel was entirely focused on threats that fitted conventional military categories, leaving them mentally and tactically unprepared for the kind of operation that British special forces were about to launch against them. The security measures implemented by Spanish authorities suffered from similar blind spots and limitations. Colonial military commanders understood their role primarily in terms of maintaining order among local populations and demonstrating Spanish sovereignty to international observers, rather than providing effective defense against military operations by major European powers. The coastal artillery positions were located and equipped to deal with conventional naval threats, surface vessels attacking in daylight using standard naval tactics, rather than small groups of raiders approaching under cover of darkness using civilian vessels and unconventional methods. Harbor patrol procedures were designed to monitor shipping traffic and prevent smuggling, rather than to detect military infiltration by highly trained special forces using specialized equipment and tactics. Even the Spanish communication systems, while adequate for normal administrative purposes, were not configured to provide the kind of immediate response capability that would be essential during the critical first minutes of an emergency situation. The human factor was perhaps even more important than these technical and organizational limitations. Spanish colonial personnel were primarily concerned with avoiding incidents that might create problems with their superiors in Madrid, rather than with achieving military effectiveness against hypothetical threats that seemed unlikely to materialize. German and Italian sailors were focused on the routine maintenance and operational requirements of merchant marine service, rather than on security procedures that seemed unnecessary in neutral ports. Even the most experienced and professional officers could not maintain constant vigilance against threats that their training and experience suggested were highly improbable. The result was a security environment that appeared adequate for normal circumstances, but was completely unprepared for the kind of extraordinary operation that British special forces were about to execute. This combination of overconfidence, intelligence failure, and tactical vulnerability created exactly the kind of situation that special forces are designed to exploit. An enemy that is strong in conventional terms, but psychologically and tactically unprepared for unconventional methods and objectives. The German and Italian vessels in Santa Isabel Harbor were not weak targets in any absolute sense. They were well-built ships with experienced crews and adequate defensive capabilities. But they were positioned, scheduled, and defended according to assumptions that bore no relationship to the actual threat they faced. Spanish colonial authorities were not incompetent or cowardly. They were professional military officers following reasonable procedures based on their understanding of their strategic situation and political constraints. But their understanding was based on conventional military thinking that could not anticipate or counter the kind of operation that was about to be launched against them. March Phillips had studied all of these factors during months of intelligence preparation, and he understood that success would depend on exploiting the gap between enemy expectation and actual British capabilities and intentions. The enemy expected British forces to behave according to conventional military and diplomatic rules. They expected attacks to be launched by identifiable military units, using standard weapons and tactics against legitimate military targets. They expected operations to be conducted in ways that minimized diplomatic complications and avoided actions that could be classified as criminal rather than military. Most importantly, they expected British decision-makers to be constrained by the same kind of bureaucratic and legal considerations that influenced their own strategic planning. Every one of these expectations was about to be proven wrong by an operation that would redefine the boundaries of warfare and demonstrate that total war recognized no limitations except those imposed by imagination and courage. At precisely 11:47 p.m., a shadow detached itself from the abandoned fishing vessel and began moving silently toward the harbor. The operation had begun, and within minutes, the comfortable assumptions that had governed Axis and Spanish thinking about British capabilities would be shattered forever. The men who had laughed at British weakness were about to discover that their laughter had been premature, and that their confidence was about to cost them more than they could possibly imagine. The stage was set for a demonstration of special warfare capabilities that would become legendary within military circles, while remaining officially secret for decades. History was about to record an operation that would prove that audacity, skill, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds and achieve objectives that conventional military thinking would dismiss as fantasy. The transformation from comfortable overconfidence to terrified confusion was about to begin, and it would happen with the kind of devastating speed that only the most perfectly executed special operations can achieve. The enemy had prepared to defend against the wrong threat, using the wrong methods while making the wrong assumptions about their adversaries' capabilities and intentions. They were about to pay the price for these errors in the most humiliating way possible, by watching helplessly as their most valuable assets were stolen from under their noses by criminals who had turned piracy into an art form and demonstrated that in total war there were no rules except victory and defeat. At 11:47 p.m., the first phase of Operation Postmaster commenced when Anders Lassen slipped over the side of the Vulcan mission, wearing only dark clothing and waterproof equipment pouches, containing the tools that would determine the mission's success or failure. The water was surprisingly warm, almost blood temperature, but the diesel fuel and garbage floating near the harbor created a slick that made silent swimming extremely difficult. Each stroke had to be precisely calculated to avoid creating ripples that would be visible to Spanish sentries, while the oil-contaminated water burned his eyes and made breathing through his nose impossible. The distance to the first target, the German freighter Licomba, was exactly 127 meters according to the measurements taken during reconnaissance. But swimming in darkness while carrying specialized equipment made accurate navigation a supreme test of skill and nerve. Lassen had memorized every landmark visible from water level, but the harbor's darkness was so complete that navigation required almost supernatural spatial awareness combined with precise timing of his movements relative to the tide and wind conditions. The first major obstacle appeared when Lassen was still 60 meters from his target. A Spanish harbor patrol boat was making an unscheduled circuit of the anchorage, its searchlight sweeping randomly across the water in patterns that seemed designed more for show than for actual security. The patrol crew was clearly conducting a routine check rather than responding to any specific threat, but their searchlight beam would easily detect a swimmer if it happened to pass over Lassen's position. For 8 minutes, that seemed like hours. He remained motionless in the oily water, using a piece of floating debris as camouflage, while the patrol boat completed its circuit and returned to the Spanish naval station on the eastern side of the harbor. The delay consumed precious minutes from his carefully calculated timeline, but attempting to continue while the patrol boat was active would have meant certain detection and the immediate failure of the entire operation. When the patrol boat's engine noise finally faded into the distance, Lassen resumed his approach to Licomba, but now he was swimming against the tide, which had changed during his enforced wait. The additional effort required to maintain his course while fighting the current was exhausting, and the oil slick seemed to be getting thicker as he approached the commercial docks where vessels routinely discharged bilge water and fuel residue. By the time he reached Likomba's hull, his lungs were burning and his muscles were beginning to cramp from the combination of physical exertion and chemical exposure. But the most dangerous part of his mission was just beginning. He had to scale the ship's side using magnetic grappling equipment while remaining completely silent, then locate and disable the anchor chain mechanisms that held the vessel in position. The German freighter's hull presented unexpected challenges that had not been apparent during daytime reconnaissance. The ship's side was covered with a layer of marine growth and rust that made finding secure attachment points for the magnetic grapplers extremely difficult, while the vessel's gentle motion in the harbor swell created a rhythm that had to be matched perfectly to avoid creating noise that would alert the crew. Lassen's specialized climbing equipment had been tested extensively during training exercises in Scottish waters, but the tropical conditions and the specific characteristics of the German vessel created problems that no amount of rehearsal had fully anticipated. The magnetic grapplers repeatedly slipped on the corroded steel surface, forcing him to attempt multiple placements while the clock continued its relentless countdown toward the moment when Spanish harbor authorities would begin their next security check. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually only 4 minutes according to his waterproof chronometer, Lassen finally achieved secure purchase on Likomba's hull and began his ascent. Each upward movement had to be executed with surgical precision to avoid creating metallic sounds that would penetrate the ship's hull and alert sleeping crew members. The physical demands were enormous. His waterlogged equipment felt like it weighed twice its normal load, and the chemical residue from the harbor water was making his hands slippery and unreliable. But mental discipline proved even more important than physical strength. Every muscle in his body wanted to rush the climb and get off the exposed hull as quickly as possible. But rushing would create noise, and noise would mean death for the entire team. The ship's rail presented the final obstacle to gaining access to Likomba's deck. German merchant vessels carried minimal armament, but they maintained standard watch procedures that included periodic checks of the ship's perimeter. Lassen had timed these checks during his reconnaissance and knew that he had approximately 12 minutes between patrols, but he also knew that schedules could change without warning if crew members decided to conduct additional security measures. As he prepared to pull himself over the rail, he heard footsteps on the deck, heavy boots moving with the deliberate pace of a bored sentry completing a routine inspection. The footsteps approached his position, paused directly above him, then continued toward the bow. For 30 seconds, Lassen hung motionless on the ship's side, his muscles screaming in protest while he waited for the sentry to move beyond hearing range. When the footsteps finally faded, Lassen pulled himself over the rail and onto Likomba's deck with a fluid motion that years of training had made instinctive. The ship's layout matched the intelligence reports exactly, a standard German freighter design with predictable placement of critical systems and equipment. The anchor windlass was located at the bow, protected by a canvas cover that would muffle the sound of his cutting tools, but would also slow his progress by requiring careful removal and replacement. The backup anchor mechanism was positioned amidships, accessible through a deck hatch that appeared to be secured only by a standard marine lock that his specialized tools could defeat within minutes. The primary anchor chain presented the greatest technical challenge of the entire operation. German merchant marine standards required chains of hardened steel that could resist normal wear and accidental damage, but they were not designed to defeat deliberate sabotage by cutting tools that had been specifically developed by British ordnance specialists for exactly this purpose. Lassen's equipment included thermite charges that could sever steel anchor chains within seconds, but thermite produced light and sparks that would be visible throughout the harbor. Silent cutting required handheld tools that would take considerably longer, but would produce no visible evidence of sabotage until the ship actually began to move. As Lassen began work on the primary anchor chain, he could hear voices from other parts of the ship. German crew members engaged in routine maintenance activities and casual conversation. The voices were not alarmed or suspicious, but they indicated that several people were awake and moving around the vessel. Any unusual sound would immediately attract investigation. An investigation would reveal the presence of unauthorized personnel conducting obviously hostile activities. The psychological pressure was enormous, But Lassen had been selected for this mission, partly because of his ability to maintain focus and precision under exactly these kinds of conditions. The cutting process required almost 20 minutes of continuous effort with specialized steel cutting tools that had to be operated with absolute silence. Each cut had to be planned and executed with surgical precision to ensure that the severed chain would not rattle or shift in ways that would alert the crew to what was happening. The work was exhausting both physically and mentally, maintaining the kind of sustained concentration required for silent operations while performing demanding physical tasks in an environment where a single mistake would be fatal. But gradually, methodically, the hardened steel began to yield to British engineering and Norwegian determination. Meanwhile, 50 meters away, Geoffrey Appleyard was facing his own set of challenges aboard the Italian vessel Duchessa d'Aosta. The Italian ship was newer than the German freighter and incorporated security features that reflected more recent experience with sabotage attempts in the Mediterranean theater. The anchor mechanisms were protected by steel housings that could not be defeated using standard cutting tools, forcing Appleyard to improvise solutions using equipment that had been designed for different purposes. The Italian crew also maintained more irregular watch schedules that made it impossible to predict when deck areas would be unoccupied, requiring constant vigilance and the ability to freeze instantly whenever footsteps or voices indicated approaching personnel. The technical challenges aboard Duchessa d'Aosta were compounded by the ship's cargo configuration, which included several tons of captured Allied documents that had been processed by Italian cryptographers and were being shipped to Germany for additional analysis. These documents were stored in specially secured compartments that required separate attention, but accessing them would require additional time that the mission timeline could not accommodate. Appleyard made the difficult decision to focus on the anchor systems and ship control mechanisms, leaving the intelligence materials for possible future operations. The decision was tactically sound, but strategically painful. Those documents could have provided valuable insights into Italian intelligence capabilities and might have revealed compromised Allied codes and communication procedures. The Italian vessel's communication systems presented additional complications that had not been fully anticipated during the planning phase. Duchessa d'Aosta carried radio equipment that was more sophisticated than standard merchant marine installations, including devices that appeared to be connected to automatic alarm systems. Disabling these systems without triggering alerts required careful analysis of wiring configurations that could only be determined by direct examination under combat conditions. Appleyard's training in explosives and demolition included extensive work with electrical systems, but the Italian equipment incorporated unfamiliar components that required improvised solutions based on general engineering principles rather than specific technical knowledge. As Appleyard worked to isolate and disable the Italian vessel's communication capabilities, he could hear radio traffic from other ships in the harbor, routine weather reports and schedule confirmations that indicated normal operations continuing without any awareness of the hostile activities taking place throughout the anchorage. The contrast between the peaceful radio chatter and the desperate urgency of his mission created a surreal psychological environment that required constant mental discipline to maintain focus on immediate technical requirements while ignoring the broader implications of discovery and failure. The third member of the boarding team, Graham Hayes, was simultaneously working aboard the German tugboat Büssing, which presented the most complex technical challenges of all three target vessels. The tugboat's engines were designed for maximum power and reliability rather than quiet operation, and they incorporated German engineering solutions that were unfamiliar to British maintenance personnel. More importantly, Büssing would serve as the primary towing vessel for the entire operation, which meant that her systems had to remain fully operational, while the other two ships were reduced to helpless cargo. Hayes had to disable the crew's ability to regain control of their vessel, while preserving all of the mechanical capabilities that would be essential for the escape phase of the operation. The German tugboat's crew quarters were located directly above the engine compartments, which meant that any work on critical systems had to be conducted within feet of sleeping personnel. The ship's designers had prioritized efficiency over security, creating access routes that allowed rapid maintenance, but also provided opportunities for sabotage by individuals who understood the vessel's systems and weaknesses. Hayes had studied technical manuals for similar German vessels during his preparation, but each ship incorporated modifications and updates that could only be identified through direct examination under operational conditions. The work required both technical expertise and intuitive understanding of German engineering principles, combined with the physical skills necessary to work in confined spaces while maintaining absolute silence. As Hayes worked to secure control of Büssing's critical systems, he encountered the first major crisis of the operation. A German crew member emerged from the forward sleeping compartment and began walking toward the engine room, apparently to check on some routine mechanical concern. Hayes had approximately 15 seconds to conceal himself and his equipment before the crew member would discover clear evidence of sabotage and hostile boarding. The tugboat's layout provided limited concealment options, and most of Hayes's equipment could not be quickly moved without making noise that would alert the approaching German sailor. Hayes made an instantaneous decision that reflected both his training and his understanding of the mission's strategic importance. Instead of attempting to hide, he positioned himself to intercept the German crew member and neutralize him before he could raise an alarm. The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds and resulted in the German sailor being rendered unconscious but not seriously injured. Hayes quickly secured the crew member and moved him to a location where he would not be discovered until long after the operation was completed. The incident demonstrated both the risks inherent in such operations and the level of skill required to manage unexpected complications without compromising the mission's overall objectives. By 12:23 a.m., all three boarding teams had successfully completed their primary objectives. The anchor systems of all three vessels had been disabled, their communication systems had been rendered inoperative, and their crews had been prevented from organizing effective resistance. But the most dangerous phase of the operation was just beginning. The vessels now had to be extracted from the harbor and moved to open water while maintaining the appearance of normal harbor operations until they were beyond the effective range of Spanish coastal defenses. The extraction phase began when March Phillips brought the Vulcan mission alongside the German tugboat Büssing and began the complex process of transferring specialized towing equipment between the vessels. The equipment had been designed specifically for this operation and included steel cables capable of handling the enormous stresses that would be generated when the tugboat attempted to tow two much larger vessels through harbor waters that included underwater obstacles and narrow channels. The transfer had to be completed in absolute darkness while maintaining the kind of precise positioning that would normally require daylight and calm water conditions. The first major challenge arose when Spanish harbor authorities initiated an unscheduled radio check with all vessels in the anchorage. Standard procedure required each ship to respond with identification codes and status reports. But the communication systems aboard all three Axis vessels had been disabled to prevent them from calling for help. March Phillips had anticipated this possibility and prepared Spanish-speaking team members to provide responses that would satisfy harbor authorities without revealing the true nature of the activities taking place throughout the port. The deception required perfect timing and flawless execution of Spanish maritime terminology, delivered by men whose primary focus was on the demanding technical tasks of connecting towing cables and preparing vessels for movement. The radio deception succeeded, but it consumed valuable time and created additional stress for team members who were already operating at the limits of their capabilities. Each minute of delay increased the probability that Spanish authorities would initiate additional security measures or that German and Italian crew members would discover evidence of the boarding actions. More critically, the harbor tide was beginning to change, which would make navigation through the port's narrow channels considerably more difficult and time-consuming. The operation was still within acceptable parameters, but margins for error were rapidly disappearing. The actual movement of the vessels began at 12:41 a.m. when Büssing's powerful engines engaged and the improvised convoy began its slow progress toward the harbor mouth. The towing cables transmitted enormous stresses between the vessels, creating mechanical challenges that tested both German engineering and British improvisation. The tugboat's engines had been designed for normal towing operations in calm water, not for the emergency extraction of unwilling cargo under combat conditions. The additional load created heat and vibration that could easily damage critical systems if the operation continued for extended periods. Navigation through the harbor required precise knowledge of underwater obstacles, channel depths, and tide conditions that had been gathered during weeks of reconnaissance, but had never been tested under actual operational conditions. The harbor's narrow entrance was dominated by Spanish coastal artillery positions that could destroy the entire convoy within minutes if Spanish commanders decided that British actions constituted a violation of neutrality that demanded military response. The psychological pressure on March Phillips was enormous. He was gambling not only with the lives of his team members, but with Britain's strategic relationship with Spain, and potentially with the entire direction of the war. As the convoy approached the harbor mouth, Spanish sentries finally noticed that something unusual was happening in the anchorage. Searchlights began sweeping across the water, and radio communications between Spanish military positions increased dramatically. But Spanish commanders faced their own set of impossible decisions. The vessels appeared to be moving under their own power in what might be legitimate harbor operations. But the timing and circumstances were highly suspicious. Opening fire without clear evidence of hostile action would create exactly the kind of international incident that Madrid had ordered them to avoid. Requesting clarification from higher authority would require time that might allow suspicious vessels to escape, but taking immediate action might trigger diplomatic crises that could destroy Spain's carefully maintained neutrality. The Spanish paralysis lasted for exactly 7 minutes, long enough for the British convoy to clear the harbor mouth and enter international waters where Spanish coastal artillery could not engage without creating clear acts of war. By the time Spanish commanders had decided that British actions justified military response, the stolen vessels were beyond effective range and moving rapidly toward British-controlled areas of the South Atlantic. The operation had succeeded beyond March Phillips's most optimistic projections, but the team understood that their real challenges were just beginning. They now had to transport their prizes across 400 miles of ocean that was patrolled by German submarines and Italian reconnaissance aircraft, maintaining radio silence while operating vessels whose crews had been neutralized but whose mechanical systems were unfamiliar to British personnel. The escape phase of Operation Postmaster required different skills and presented different challenges from the infiltration and capture phases, but it was equally critical to the mission's ultimate success. The stolen vessels had to maintain formation and course while operating at maximum sustainable speed, but they could not afford mechanical failures that would leave them stranded within range of Axis pursuit forces. German and Italian intelligence services would quickly determine what had happened in Fernando Po harbor, and every available resource would be dedicated to intercepting the convoy before it could reach British protection. The race was on, and the next 50 hours would determine whether the most audacious maritime theft in history would be remembered as a brilliant success or a catastrophic failure. The immediate aftermath of the harbor escape created chaos that rippled through military and diplomatic channels across 3 continents. Spanish colonial authorities found themselves in an impossible position. They had allowed 3 Axis vessels to be stolen from their harbor without firing a shot, but they could not admit this failure without revealing the inadequacy of their defenses and their inability to maintain the neutrality they had promised to both sides. German and Italian commanders faced their own crisis of credibility. How could 3 valuable vessels disappear from a friendly neutral port without any of their crews managing to transmit even a basic distress signal? The answers to these questions would require investigations that might take weeks, but the stolen ships would reach British territory within days if they were not intercepted by Axis naval forces operating in the South Atlantic. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of German U-boat operations, received word of the Fernando Po incident at 3:17 a.m. Berlin time while he was reviewing patrol reports from the North Atlantic convoy battles. His initial reaction was disbelief. No enemy force had ever conducted such a blatant violation of neutral waters, and the tactical requirements for simultaneous capture of 3 vessels seemed beyond the capabilities of any British units known to be operating in West African waters. But intelligence reports quickly confirmed that the missing vessels were indeed moving toward British territory, under circumstances that could only be explained by enemy action of unprecedented audacity and skill. Dönitz immediately diverted 2 U-boats from convoy interdiction duties to positions where they might intercept the stolen ships. But he understood that the British raiders had gained a crucial time advantage that would be difficult to overcome. The Italian Regia Marina faced similar challenges in responding to the crisis. Admiral Angelo Iachino commanded naval forces in the South Atlantic that included several destroyers and reconnaissance aircraft capable of intercepting slow-moving merchant, but these forces were positioned to defend against conventional British naval operations, rather than to pursue individual ships that had been stolen through criminal action. More importantly, Italian naval doctrine emphasized fleet operations and coordinated attacks rather than the kind of individual pursuit missions that would be required to intercept the British convoy. Redirecting forces to deal with the Fernando Po crisis would compromise other strategic operations that had been planned for weeks and would reveal Italian operational capabilities to British intelligence services that were undoubtedly monitoring all radio communications related to the incident. The diplomatic implications were equally complex and potentially even more damaging than the immediate military consequences. Spain's failure to protect Axis shipping in her territorial waters raised fundamental questions about Spanish reliability as a neutral power and Spanish capability to maintain the kind of secure environment that German and Italian operations required. Franco's government had assured both Berlin and Rome that Spanish neutrality would be strictly enforced and that Axis forces could depend on Spanish territory for refueling, maintenance, and intelligence support. The Fernando Po incident demonstrated that these assurances were worthless against determined British action, and it raised the possibility that other supposedly secure Spanish territories might be equally vulnerable to British raids. German diplomatic pressure on Spanish authorities began within hours of the incident, but Spanish responses revealed the fundamental weakness of their position. Colonial officials claimed that the missing vessels had departed according to legitimate harbor procedures and that no evidence of hostile action had been observed by Spanish military personnel. This explanation was obviously false. 3 ships did not simultaneously decide to leave port in the middle of the night without filing proper departure documents or notifying harbor authorities of their intentions. But Spanish officials could not admit the truth without acknowledging their complete failure to maintain harbor security and their inability to prevent criminal acts in their own territorial waters. The intelligence value of the stolen vessels became apparent as soon as British specialists began examining their cargo and documentation. The German freighter Licomba contained precision-manufactured submarine components that would have kept several U-boats operational for months if they had reached their intended destinations. More valuable still were the technical manuals and maintenance procedures that revealed previously unknown details about German submarine capabilities and vulnerabilities. Italian documentation aboard Duchessa d'Aosta included captured Allied signals that had been processed by Italian cryptographers, providing British intelligence with crucial insights into enemy code-breaking capabilities and potentially compromised Allied communication procedures. The German tugboat Büsing represented the greatest intelligence windfall of all. Her cargo included complete sets of German naval codes, weather routing instructions, and recognition signals that would allow Allied forces to masquerade as Axis vessels or intercept and decode enemy transmissions throughout the West African theater. The strategic value of these materials was incalculable. They provided Britain with intelligence advantages that might last for months and could influence the outcome of military operations across the entire South Atlantic region. But their value would last only as long as German authorities remained unaware that they had been compromised, which meant that their exploitation required careful coordination with ongoing Allied intelligence operations. The psychological impact of Operation Postmaster extended far beyond its immediate intelligence and material benefits. German and Italian military personnel throughout the colonial world now had to consider the possibility that British special forces might strike anywhere, at any time, using methods that conventional military thinking could not anticipate or counter. Harbor security procedures that had seemed adequate for defending against conventional naval attacks now appeared laughably insufficient against adversaries willing to conduct criminal acts while disguised as civilian personnel. The comfortable assumption that neutral territory provided sanctuary from enemy action had been shattered forever, replaced by a new reality in which nowhere was safe from British determination and ingenuity. Spanish colonial authorities throughout Africa and Latin America found themselves facing impossible security requirements that their limited resources could not meet. If Britain was willing to violate Spanish neutrality in West Africa, there was no reason to assume that other Spanish territories would be safe from similar attacks. But providing adequate security against British special forces would require military resources that Spain could not afford, and security measures that would compromise the commercial activities that provided essential revenue for colonial administrations. The result was a chronic state of uncertainty that complicated every aspect of Spanish colonial policy and created opportunities for further British operations that might prove even more damaging than Operation Postmaster. The international legal implications of the Fernando Po raid were equally significant and long-lasting. Britain had violated Spanish territorial sovereignty, conducted acts of piracy in neutral waters, and stolen property belonging to nations with which Britain was technically at war, but which had been under the protection of Spanish neutrality. These actions violated virtually every principle of international maritime law and diplomatic protocol that governed relations between civilized nations. Yet Britain faced no meaningful sanctions for these violations because Spain lacked the power to enforce international law against a major belligerent, and German and Italian protests were dismissed by neutral nations as hypocritical complaints from aggressors who had themselves violated international law on countless occasions. The precedent established by Operation Postmaster would influence British strategic thinking throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. If criminal methods could achieve strategic objectives that conventional military operations could not accomplish, then total war demanded the use of whatever methods proved effective regardless of their legality or diplomatic consequences. This philosophy would guide British special operations throughout occupied Europe, in Southeast Asia, and in other theaters where conventional military advantages were insufficient to achieve essential strategic objectives. The boundaries between legitimate military action and criminal activity had been permanently blurred, creating new categories of warfare that would persist long after the specific circumstances of World War II had passed into history. As March Phillips and his team continued their race toward British territory, they understood that they had achieved something unprecedented in the history of warfare. They had demonstrated that small groups of highly trained specialists could accomplish objectives that entire fleets might fail to achieve through conventional military action. They had proven that audacity combined with technical skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds and achieve strategic gains that would influence the course of major military campaigns. Most importantly, they had shown that total war recognized no limitations except those imposed by imagination, courage, and the willingness to accept consequences that conventional military thinking would consider unacceptable. The stolen vessels reached British-controlled waters without interception by German or Italian forces, completing one of the most successful special operations in military history. But the true significance of Operation Postmaster extended far beyond its immediate tactical success. It had demonstrated principles of unconventional warfare that would reshape military thinking for generations to come, establish precedents for international law that continue to influence global politics today, and proved that in total war, the boundaries between legal and illegal action become irrelevant compared to the imperative of victory. The men who had laughed at British weakness would never laugh again, and the comfortable assumptions that had governed Axis strategic thinking had been shattered forever by an operation that would be remembered as a masterpiece of audacity, skill, and strategic imagination. The final phase of Operation Postmaster unfolded across 48 hours of sustained tension as the stolen convoy pushed southward through waters where German U-boats maintained regular patrols and Italian reconnaissance aircraft conducted systematic searches for Allied shipping. March Phillips maintained strict radio silence while monitoring German and Italian transmissions that revealed the enemy's desperate efforts to locate and intercept the missing vessels. The interception of enemy communications provided crucial intelligence about search patterns and patrol schedules, but it also revealed the enormous resources being devoted to recovering the stolen ships and capturing or killing the men responsible for their theft. By dawn on January 16th, the convoy had covered nearly 200 miles from Fernando Po, but fuel consumption calculations indicated that they were burning diesel at rates that exceeded their planned consumption by almost 15%. The additional load imposed by towing two unwilling vessels was creating mechanical stresses that threatened to disable Bussing's engines before they could reach British protection. March Phillips faced a critical decision: continue at maximum speed and risk mechanical failure that would leave them stranded within range of enemy forces, or reduce speed to preserve the engines, while increasing their exposure to interception by German submarines that were undoubtedly converging on their projected course.
The decision was complicated by intelligence reports indicating that Spanish authorities had finally overcome their bureaucratic paralysis and were providing full cooperation to German and Italian search efforts. Spanish colonial aircraft were now conducting reconnaissance flights that could identify the stolen vessels and vector enemy forces to their location.
More ominously, Spanish naval units were reportedly being repositioned to intercept the convoy if it approached any Spanish territory while attempting to reach British bases. The comfortable assumption that Spanish inefficiency would provide protection had been replaced by the harsh reality that Spain was now actively supporting enemy efforts to recover the stolen vessels and capture their British crews. At 2:30 p.m. on January 16th, the crisis intensified when lookouts aboard the convoy spotted aircraft approaching from the northeast, Italian reconnaissance planes conducting systematic searches along the most probable routes toward British territory. The aircraft were still several miles away, but they were following flight patterns that would inevitably bring them close enough to identify the stolen vessels and report their position to Italian naval forces. March Phillips ordered emergency procedures that had been rehearsed but never tested under actual conditions. The towing cables were quickly reconfigured to allow the convoy to alter course rapidly, and camouflage materials were deployed to change the visual profile of the vessels when observed from aircraft. The deception succeeded partially. The Italian aircraft observed the convoy, but apparently failed to recognize the stolen vessels among the legitimate shipping that used these sea lanes for normal commercial purposes. However, the encounter demonstrated that continued progress along predictable routes would inevitably result in identification and interception by enemy forces that were systematically searching every possible approach to British territory. March Phillips was forced to adopt a more indirect route that would extend their journey by at least 12 hours, while consuming fuel reserves that were already stretched to dangerous limits. The psychological pressure on the team was becoming enormous. They had succeeded in the most difficult phase of their mission, infiltrating enemy territory, capturing 3 valuable vessels, and escaping from neutral waters without triggering immediate military response. But success would be meaningless if they were intercepted and destroyed before reaching British protection. Each hour brought them closer to safety, but also closer to the point where fuel exhaustion would leave them helpless against enemy forces that were systematically narrowing their options for escape. The second night of their escape brought new challenges that tested both their equipment and their endurance. A tropical storm system moved across their route, generating waves that threatened to part the towing cables and winds that made navigation extremely difficult. The stolen vessels, never designed to operate as an integrated convoy, responded differently to the storm conditions and threatened to collide with each other despite the best efforts of their British crews to maintain formation. For 6 hours, the convoy struggled through conditions that would have challenged experienced merchant marine officers operating familiar vessels under normal circumstances. The storm provided unexpected benefits as well as obvious dangers. German U-boats found it impossible to maintain effective searches in the rough seas, and Italian aircraft were grounded by weather conditions that made reconnaissance flights extremely hazardous. The convoy's radio discipline was tested when they intercepted German transmissions indicating that search efforts had been temporarily suspended due to the weather. But March Phillips maintained silence despite the temptation to communicate their status to Royal Navy units that might be positioned to provide assistance during the final approach to British territory. Dawn on January 17th revealed that the storm had pushed the convoy further west than their planned route, adding additional distance to their journey while consuming fuel at rates that left no margin for further navigation errors. More critically, their position had been shifted toward shipping lanes, where German submarine patrols were more frequent, and where Spanish naval units might be positioned to intercept vessels attempting to reach British territory through unconventional routes. The team faced the possibility that their successful escape from Fernando Po might end in capture or destruction within sight of safety. At 11:15 a.m., the convoy's lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon that might indicate approaching naval vessels. The smoke was too distant to identify specific ship types, but its location and movement suggested military units rather than commercial traffic. March Phillips ordered the convoy to alter course while maintaining maximum sustainable speed, but the additional maneuvering consumed fuel and time that they could not afford to lose. For 2 hours, the mysterious vessels paralleled their course at a distance that made identification impossible, but suggested deliberate tracking rather than coincidental navigation. The identification crisis was resolved when the pursuing vessels finally came close enough for visual recognition. They were British destroyers conducting patrol operations along the approaches to British West Africa. The Royal Navy ships had detected the convoy through routine surveillance and had been tracking them to determine their identity and intentions. Radio contact was finally established, confirming the successful completion of Operation Postmaster and arranging for escort protection during the final approach to British territory. The stolen vessels reached Freetown, Sierra Leone, at 4:47 p.m. on January 17th, completing a journey that had covered over 600 miles through enemy-controlled waters while carrying cargo whose strategic value exceeded the worth of entire military divisions. The immediate material gains were substantial. German submarine components that would have kept U-boats operational for months, Italian intelligence materials that revealed enemy capabilities and compromised security procedures, and German naval codes that would provide strategic advantages throughout the West African theater. But the psychological and strategic implications of the operation's success were even more significant than its immediate material benefits. German and Italian military commanders throughout the colonial world now understood that British special forces possessed capabilities that conventional intelligence assessments had failed to identify or properly evaluate. Harbor security measures that had seemed adequate for defending against traditional naval attacks were revealed as completely insufficient against adversaries willing to employ criminal methods while accepting the risks of execution as pirates if captured. The comfortable assumption that neutral territory provided sanctuary from enemy action had been permanently shattered, replaced by a new reality where British determination and ingenuity could strike anywhere without warning. Spanish colonial authorities faced their own crisis of confidence and capability. Their failure to prevent the theft of 3 Axis vessels from their territorial waters had demonstrated the inadequacy of their defenses and their inability to maintain the neutrality they had promised to all parties. German and Italian pressure for improved security measures conflicted with Spanish resource limitations and political constraints, creating ongoing tensions that would complicate Axis operations throughout Spanish territories for the remainder of the war. The international legal implications of Operation Postmaster established precedents that continue to influence maritime law and international relations today. Britain had demonstrated that strategic necessity could justify violations of international law when conventional legal remedies were inadequate to address critical security requirements. The operation proved that in total war, the boundaries between legal and illegal action become irrelevant compared to the imperative of achieving objectives essential for national survival. For the men who had executed Operation Postmaster, success brought recognition within the narrow circle of British Special Operations personnel, while maintaining the official secrecy that protected both their methods and their future operational capabilities. March Phillips and his team had proven that small groups of highly trained specialists could accomplish strategic objectives that conventional military forces might fail to achieve, despite enormous advantages in numbers and firepower. They had established principles of unconventional warfare that would guide British special operations throughout the remainder of the war and influence military thinking for generations to come. The stolen vessels were quickly integrated into British merchant marine operations, their German and Italian markings replaced with British registrations that concealed their origins while maximizing their contribution to Allied logistics requirements. The intelligence materials they carried provided strategic advantages that influenced military operations across multiple theaters, from North Atlantic convoy battles to Mediterranean campaigns where knowledge of enemy capabilities and procedures saved countless Allied lives. But perhaps the most important legacy of Operation Postmaster was psychological rather than material. The operation had demonstrated that British resolve and ingenuity could overcome seemingly impossible odds through the application of unconventional methods that enemy forces could not anticipate or counter. It proved that total war demanded total commitment to achieving victory, regardless of the legal, diplomatic, or moral constraints that might limit action under peacetime conditions. The German officers who had laughed at British weakness in the bars of Santa Isabel would never laugh again. The comfortable assumptions that had guided Axis strategic thinking had been shattered by an operation that redefined the boundaries of warfare and demonstrated that in the struggle for national survival, Audacity combined with technical skill could achieve what conventional military power could not accomplish. The thunder had spoken, and its message was clear. In total war, there were no sanctuaries, no safe harbors, and no limitations except those imposed by imagination and courage. History isn't just written. It's remembered through those who still care to listen. The men who conducted Operation Postmaster understood that they were participating in something unprecedented in the annals of warfare, an operation that would influence military thinking long after the specific circumstances of World War II had passed into history. What story should we tell next? Subscribe to keep their memory alive. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps me keep making better content for you.